Hi, welcome back to the channel. At this channel, I attempt to give you code that you can copy and paste and quickly integrate the code into your own personal projects. Today, we'll be talking about memoization, which is simply a fancy term that says optimize your code and be more resources friendly. In React, there are three main ways to memoize our code. They are react.memo, useMemo, and use callback. We'll be going through each and every single one of them in detail, but first, if you have not watched my previous video about forms, I would highly recommend you to go and watch it first so you can pick up where we left off and be able to follow this code easily. With that said, let's get started. Let's refresh this so we have a fresh form. To pick up where we left off from our last video, I added a few console logs to demonstrate how memoization works. I added a console log in form is valid, a console log down here so we know when the form component is getting re-rendered, a console log in form skeleton. I don't have one there, as well as a console log in form input field where it says rendering input with the name, and the name is, as you can see down here, email, username, password respectively for each of the fields. And finally, a console log for the button. Here, before we move on, I want to quickly recap and talk about how and when React re-renders a component. There are three main reasons for a component to re-render. The first and simplest one would be when any of the states changes. If you have a component and you're using the useState function to give it a state, to make it stateful, when any of these states changes, the React component here will re-render. And the second condition where a React component re-renders itself would be when the props change. Let's say form skeleton is taking all these props here. If any of them changes, form skeleton is gonna re-render. It's gonna get re-rendered by React because one of its props have changed. And finally, the third reason why a React component will render is when its parent component re-renders. For example, having this form component here, if the form component re-renders, and if we do not use any memoization techniques, everything underneath it, or any of its children, would be re-rendered as well. For instance, form skeleton would get re-rendered, form input fields would get re-rendered, the button would get re-rendered, anything in form input fields like form input field would also get re-rendered, and all the way down the tree. So how can we prevent this, and why do we even want to prevent this? Let's take a look at this concrete example here. So if we clear out the console, and let's type something in our username field here. As you can see, all of the components are getting re-rendered right now. We have our form is valid getting logged, base form, skeleton, input, email, input username, input password, as well as the button. But do we really need to re-render all of them? Notice how we're really only changing the username here. Ideally, we would want to change what is necessary only. Concretely, what that means is the input field for the email, the input field for password, and the button here, they should not be rendered because none of the states or props of them have changed. So that's what memoization is all about. We want to only re-render the components that are necessary and leave the rest that are unchanged untouched. How can we do this though? So let's go back to our input field component here. We want to take a look at how or what changes when we type into this field here. In our return box, we have our input tag where we pass this function to the onChange handler. And this is what's getting called when we type into this box here. We see that we set a submit error to an empty string, and this only sets the state in the form component if the form submit error is not an empty string before. But let's disregard that for a second. What I really want to talk about is this one here. As you can see, we create a new array, we create a new data, we set the value to what we type in, we set is valid to true, and then we set error message to an empty string. We do all that, we assign the new data to the new array at that index, which would be index 1 for this one. And then we return a new array, which then sets the state in the parent component. To be clear, notice how set data is getting passed all the way from the form component to the form skeleton component right here, and then to the form input fields component, and then to the form input field component, and then we use it here. So when we call set data, we are really setting a state in our parent component here, in our most parent component here, which is the form component. And because we are setting the state of the form component, what happens is all its children, form skeleton, and all the way down, form input fields, form input field, the button, they're all getting re-rendered. Hence, when I type in to this box here, you see that the base form is getting re-rendered, the skeleton, email, username, password, as well as the button. And that is why this form is not optimized. How can we solve this? We begin by using React.memo. React.memo is a function, or more accurately, it's a wrapper around functional components. What React.memo does is you use it to wrap it around a functional component, and it watches for any changes in the props. To reiterate, React.memo wraps a functional component and it watches the props of all these this component and see if any of them has changed. If any of them has changed, if any of the props have changed, React would then proceed to re-render the functional component. If, however, any of these props do not change, all of these props do not change, React does not re-render the component, therefore optimizing performance. Let's try it out. So let's replace our form input field with our React.memo form input field and see if it works. Let's refresh this, clear the console, and type in username right now. Okay, so what's happening here? We see that form is valid is getting printed out. We have our base form, our form skeleton, our input username, and our button. This time, email and password, they are not getting printed out. Why? Because the data, or more accurately, the props of this input field and this input field remain the same. Since it did not change, React.memo says, okay, I'm not going to re-render it because there's no need to re-render the fields. However, for this field, this form input field for username, the data for it has changed. Because the data for it changed, we are going to re-render it. Hence, you see, re-rendering input username. What about the button? We can do the exact same thing for our button here. We save that, clear console, and now let's try and type again. As you can see, the button is also not getting re-rendered now. We have come another step closer to our memoization completion. Now, let's take a look at from input fields, I'm not printing out anything here, but you would imagine that if I do not memoize it, form input fields would get re-rendered every time, even when the data, the props have not changed. To be clear, what I'm saying is if form, the parent component, gets re-rendered, and if the props here have not changed, form input fields would get re-rendered anyway if we do not memoize it, just like how you've seen in form input field and form submit button. Therefore, let's memoize that too. Now back to form skeleton, and you can also do that for form skeleton for the same reason. And now let's take a look at what happens when we have an error. Okay, so again, in form input field, remember that we have the function that sets the value on this field here, but we also have this validate function. This validate function, what does it do? It sets the data, it sets the is valid and error message field on the object, and it validates that, and then it also sets the field validity field. So if we do get an error, let's make it really clear here. If we do get an error, you see that form is valid gets printed out, and then the base form skeleton, input username, and then it gets printed out a second time. So why is that? Why does that happen? So let's go through the logic flow once more. We change the value to nothing. We change it from A to an empty string. This block here gets fired. When this block here gets fired, data is getting set in the form component, and then it gets propagated all the way down from form to form skeleton to form input fields to form input field, and we use the value here. Because the value here has changed, our useEffect hook gets fired. The useEffect hook then calls the validate function. The validate function then runs all this. The validation function runs all this, and then it sees that field validity does not equal to all rules passed. And then it sets the state of field validities. Again, set field validities is a function that got passed all the way down from form to form skeleton, form input fields, and down to form input field.jsx. So again, we go all the way back to the form component, and then we set the data there and here, and then because the state of the form component got changed, all the components down, or all its children component, will get rendered again. That's why you see two sets of these logs getting printed out, and they're the exact same. Notice how though there's no email or password or button getting printed out. That is because we memoized all our components with react.memo. Again, just a real quick reminder, all you have to do to memoize your component using react.memo is to wrap it around like this. Okay, so now we have talked about that. We know that react.memo memoizes functional components. Let's talk about what useMemo and useCallback do. Okay, let's go back to our form again and let's refresh this, clear this, and now let's try and type again. We see that, yes, it's memoized for the components, it's good. And we type again. Notice how form is valid is getting printed out every single time. Is this really necessary? As you can see, the validity of the form itself has not changed, right? The whole entire form is still valid at this point. It's still blue, there's no red color there, so we know it's valid. But we are calling this function every single time when the form component is re-rendered. Now, this function here is not a really expensive function. As you can see, all it does is it checks each and every single one of field validities field and see if they're equal to true. If any of them does not equal to true, then we return a false value for form is valid. It's a very simple function, therefore you might not want to memorize it, but just for the sake of this tutorial, let's see what useMemo does when we do that. Let's clear our console and refresh this, clear it again, and now let's type. You see that form is valid does not get printed out anymore. Can try a few more times. Form is valid does not get printed out, which means that the function that gives us the value form is valid does not get called every time our base form gets re-rendered. Again, let's refresh this. We see that on the first run, form is valid gets printed out, and then on subsequent re-renders, form is valid does not get printed out. Again, this is because of the magic behind useMemo. useMemo is used to memoize values. Again, as you can see here, form is valid is a value that got returned by the function here. We want to memoize values when we have a really expensive computation that gives us the value. For this one, it's not really an expensive function as we're only checking 3 fields and see if any of them equal to false. If not, return true. But imagine if you have a really expensive function that you need to call. For example, let's say if you have a machine learning function that you need to call. Every time, if you call that function and run it every time your component renders, even though none of the related or none of the dependencies have changed, it would be a very expensive and unnecessary computation, right? Because you would get back the same value every time as the dependency has not changed. Now, you might wonder, what if our form's validity does change? Does it get recomputed? So let's take a look at that. Right now, when I type form is valid does not get called, but as soon as form is valid changes, we see that the value gets printed out. So we know that form is valid got called again because the form's validity changed. How do we do this? This is done by simply passing in the function's dependency. As you can see in this function here, the only dependency would be field validities, since we're checking the fields in there and see if all of them equal to true. And then we pass that to what we call the dependency array. It is an array that contains all the dependencies for the function that you pass into useMemo. What this is doing concretely is saying, okay, I do not want to call this function every time my form component gets re-rendered, but I definitely want you to call it when field validities have changed. When field validities have changed, React, please call this function so I can get an accurate value, an up-to-date value. That is how we can update form is valid, but at the same time, do not compute unnecessary computations. This is very useful, again, for very expensive computations. For example, if you have a Fibonacci, a hypothetical Fibonacci calculation function, and let's say the number is really high, because Fibonacci is a highly recursive function, it's going to be very expensive. We do not want to call it every time unless the dependency has changed. And that is where use memo is very useful. Again, because this function is not really that expensive, it's really up to personal preference if you want to call use memo or not, because use memo, although it does memoize your value for you and it avoids unnecessary computations, it does require some kind of resources for you to use it, right? When you call use memo in memory, it does allocate some memory in your computer somewhere and call that function when you call it, when you want it called. Therefore, it's up to your decision to make the call whether if you want to use memo or not. Finally, we have use callback. To understand what use callback does, I created a little text box down here with the state text and the function set text. Again, it's just a simple text box here where when we type into it, we change the state of the text, and then the value would be the text itself. Now, let's take a look at what happens when I type into this text box here. I type into it, you see that base form gets re-rendered, and we know that is necessary since the state of the base form is getting changed. But form skeleton is also getting re-rendered. Let's make sure and try a few times. Yes, we see that we are rendering form skeleton when we type into this. But if you remember, form skeleton is the skeleton of this form. It is completely unrelated to this input field. So why do we re-render form skeleton when we don't have to? And you might wonder, hey, didn't I already memoize form skeleton? Why is it still getting re-rendered? This is a very weird question that comes up oftentimes when you try to memoize a React component. Let's recall what React.memo does. React.memo watches the props of the component that you call upon it, in this case, form skeleton. So all these props are getting watched by React.memo, and React.memo only allows the component to be re-rendered when one of the props has changed. But you're saying, oh, we are setting the text here. How is it possible that any of these states have changed? Data, set data, field validities, set validities, loading, all of these are unrelated to the text box down here. So why is it getting changed? This is because this is due to a problem called referential equality. In JavaScript, when we create a function, we give it some memory, we give it some space in our computer's memory. We say that, okay, I'm creating this function, I want to give it some space, so in the future when I want to call it, I can call it, right? Here, let's take a look at form skeletons props. Okay, we have all these props that are getting passed down to form skeleton. We have 4 values. So on my IDE, the blue ones are values and the yellow ones are functions. We see that there are 4 values, and values do not have the referential equality problem. And any function that React gives you when you call useState do not have that problem. Therefore, it must mean that handle submit here is a problem. So what exactly is a problem? Again, let's talk about referential equality in a little bit more detail. When React re-renders this form component, it sees that you want this function called handle submit. Therefore, it creates this function. When you type into this box though, the state changes. The state changes, but React does not know that this function needs to be the same. It does not know you want a function to be the same. Although it has the same name, it recreates a brand new copy, a fresh copy of this function called handle submit. Remember how we talked about in the computer's memory, there was already a function called handle submit. And now we are creating another one that is also called handle submit, but it's in a different space in your computer's memory. Therefore, when you pass it down to the form skeleton component, it sees that, hey, I know this function has the same name, but since it has a different place in memory, it must be a different function, right? Wrong. Our React component does not know that we do not want to re-render this function. Therefore, it just calls it every time we render the form. It gets recreated, which is what we do not want. So what we can do here is use callback. I created a brand new function called handle submit memo. I wrap it around use callback. And again, I pass it a dependency array called form is valid. And let's see what this does now. Let's refresh this. Have a form, and now let's type in this box. Rendering base form. And you can see, I keep typing into this text. It's only rendering base form now. The form skeleton does not get re-rendered, which is exactly what we want. So how was this achieved? Let's take a look at use callback in detail. Use callback accepts a function. So we pass it a function, and this function is exactly the same as handle submit here. We pass it a function, wrap it around the function, and then we pass it a dependency array, which tells use callback to recreate this function when this value changes. Now, because we called use callback, handle submit memo does not get recreated when the form component gets re-rendered. Therefore, it gets passed down into our form skeleton, and then form skeleton just keeps using that. Form skeleton just keeps using that, even though form component gets re-rendered. That will save us some resources on our computer's memory, and it will optimize your code. Well, with a caveat. But before we talk about that, let's understand what this form is valid is doing here. Form is valid is necessary because when we first render the component, form is valid is true, right? Because the form is valid, as you can see, it's blue in color here. But we want this function to be recreated though. When form is valid is changed, the value of it is changed, we want to recreate this handle submit memo function. What I mean exactly is when I change the value form is valid, which would happen as soon as I press backspace here, we want this function to be recreated. The reason why we want this function to be recreated is because we use this form is valid value here. We use the value of form is valid in here. Therefore, it's dependent, the logic in here is dependent on form is valid. That is why we pass form is valid into this dependency array. And now this use callback function is always up to date as long as our form is valid value change. If it changes, I recreate it. If it does not change, I do not recreate it. You might have caught that I did not pass the data state into this dependency array, and you would be right. I do need to pass it to the dependency array since my function is dependent on the data state. If you did catch that, kudos to you. Finally, I would like to end this tutorial about when or why you should memoization, when or why you should use or not use memoization. Remember, when you're coding up a simple project, you do not necessarily need to memoize every single component and optimize every single function that you write. You would only need to do that if your function is very expensive. If you're calling a very expensive function, you might really want to consider memoizing that function. And you can do that by use memo or use callback, depending on whether if you want to return a value or a function like this one. Next, memoization requires some resources too. We need to know that because we're trying to memoize something, we call use memo, use callback, react.memo. All these functions are not for free. They use some resources in your memory, in your computer's memory, and because it uses those resources, if the function that you're memoizing, for example, this one here is not, for example, this one here, it's not very expensive. Because it's not very expensive, the memoization benefit that we get from using use memo might just be outweighed by the resources that we use when we use memo. That means the memoization or the optimization actually had a net negative effect. So if your function is not very expensive, just go with a simpler route and avoid memoization at all. Do not even think about it. However, if you're writing a component that needs to be highly optimized, or if you notice that your component is rather slow, you might want to check your code and see where you can memoize your functions or your states or your components. With that, I would like to thank you for listening to this presentation, and I will see you next time. Thanks.